We are very pleased that you are here with us this afternoon, and as you can see, the title of our presentation is Planning for the Future. It's never too early or too soon, and we really do believe that things that happen early on do impact outcomes for individuals with disabilities, and that the more that we can support all the way along, the better the outcomes as they become adults. Everyone has received a seed packet when you came in, and we're thinking about it's springtime and it's time to start thinking about planting and growing. And we want you to read the question and have just a brief thinking time, and then join someone else at a table and have a conversation about how is transition planning like planting and caring for a garden. So once you have kind of an idea, then if you join somebody else at a different table and have just a brief conversation. All right, let's look at the question again. It says, how is transition planning like planting and caring for a garden? What were some of the things that you talked about as a group at your table? All right, so you had to kind of prepare before you even started. So when we're going out and selecting that seed and the soil and the fertilizer, we have to know what's right and what is that language, what's the terminology. So how about this table? So how much sun, how much rain? Yep, exactly. So that was just kind of our way of starting to think about kind of all the things that go into transition planning, and that it's when you start, but it is a continual care. It's progress, things change. So it's not that we're just waiting for them to be done, because as we said, if we have adult children with disabilities, you're still not done. But you aren't with any other child either. So that's just a nice way to start to think about what does it take to start planning for transition. And it's never too soon. So if you want to go back to where you were before, that's fine. If you want to stay at the table and engage in the conversation, that's perfectly fine as well.
On the packet, in the packet that you got, the first one that you'll be looking at is from the Minnesota Secondary Transition Toolkit for Families. And one of the things we'll be doing this afternoon is, within an hour, we don't really have time to use the tools or practice them while we're here. But there are a few tools that we'll be giving you, and also a resource list with some links, some websites where you can find a lot of additional information. So this particular document is basically an introductory page, changed just a little bit so it would fit on one sheet, from that transition toolkit that Minnesota has developed. And the reference for that is on our resource list. If you look at it, it will have some references to Minnesota. And since I'm from northern Iowa, I almost sounded like a Minnesotan when I said that, I think. So being an Iowa resident, there are a few things that'll be different, but the concepts and the process are all good to use, whether you live in Iowa, whether you live in Arizona, whether you live in Minnesota. So one of the things that they stress in this toolkit, which is why it was appealing to Ann and I, is the idea of starting early. And so when we look at why we want to plan and start early, sometimes, as if you look at this document, and you'll have a chance to take it with you and read it over later, and I would encourage you to do that, it talks about how the idea of planning early is an important thing for families with students who have disabilities. Those of us who have been in those shoes, as well as many professionals who work with us side by side, recognize that every day while you're going through life, you're probably not going to be thinking about the end goal. You know, you're not going to be thinking, when you have a 2-month-old who has significant health or other issues, gee, I wonder what Susie's going to do when Susie's 25, all right? However, there are many things that we can do in our day-to-day work, in and out of school, in the community, at home, that will help develop skills that will help increase opportunities for individuals as adults. The second document in the stack that I gave you, and you'll get a few more, would you hold that up and show them what it looks like? Yep, that's the one. Talks about employability skills. And the reason we chose this one, this is actually from the Iowa Core. The information is from there. This is formatted in a progression. In other words, starting with one thing and how you move from one thing to another as far as skill development. The reason we chose the one about employability, you'll find them about reading, math, etc., is because these are some of what we call employability skills or interpersonal skills or soft skills, things that help people be successful as adults as well as the academic stuff. So this is the one we chose to use as an example. These are expectations for all kids in Iowa. It's the Iowa Core. You've probably heard about that in planning, both at your IEP meetings for your students as well as just generally around. So the one I thought I would pull out as an example to illustrate this is if you look at the first column on the left, second bullet down. Number one, this is about communication and working appropriately with others. So that's the ultimate goal that we want to see. And if you look at the second bullet down, work appropriately and productively with others, demonstrate good listening skills. So K through 2, kindergarten through second grade, we really want kids to focus on and work on listening skills. Third through fifth grade, they need to be able to articulate, although God help them, I hope they don't need to spell that word, articulate thoughts and ideas clearly in writing and speaking. If they get that down, then the next thing they look at is effectively communicating within the group. And it doesn't mean that they just do one skill, then move to the next, and then the next. But this is kind of the building blocks of those skills. Effectively communicate with the group and with stakeholders, so beyond the group, whatever that looks like. So this is just an example, and there are many on this document that you can look at. The idea is that whether the student that you're working with is working on this skill and they're in kindergarten, or whether they're working on this skill and they're in, say, 4th or 5th grade, that doesn't matter. What matters is that these skills build one on the other. And so the question that we have as we're working with the kids is, where are they at with these skills, even early on? And what needs to happen so that we can support them in developing those skills and making their way to the next step or progression. Does that make sense? Okay. So the next document that you look at looks like this. And this is a tool that has been developed to help evaluate where students are at. And as I mentioned before, we don't have time today to do a lot of application of the tools, but we do have time to introduce you to some and show you where, kind of what they're like and give you some resources. If you look at this and see the kind of the grading, if you will, at the top, where it says almost never, rarely, occasionally, frequently, almost always. Pretty simple concepts, and as a family member or as an educator, when you go down the list and look at the skills, you have a pretty good idea, probably, or you can observe, collect information so that you'll know where your child or student is at, and then you can work on those skills. So when we're looking at assessment or evaluation, sometimes families, I think, don't feel like they're equipped to be involved and help contribute to that conversation, but you are. Because all of the time you spend with your child outside of school at home, when they're growing up before they even enter the doors of the school building, when you're with them in the evenings, weekends, when you have them in the community, and provide opportunities for them to practice these skills, you have a good idea of where they're at and what they're doing. So part of the idea of transition planning early and as the kids get older is contributing to those conversations, looking at the skills they've got, and also letting the team know your perspective on how the kids are doing. Questions so far? All right. The next document you have is called Guiding Your Success Tool and looks like this. When you get this, and there is a link to that as well on the resource list, so you'll find actually a full booklet with lots of good information. You'll be getting that. Yeah. This Guiding Your Success tool is something that was developed by the National Collaborative on Workforce and Disability for Youth. Lots of very bright people pulled this together, and I believe one of the best things they did is with all their brains together, they figured out a very simple way to do some very good things. And if you look at the guideposts on the front cover, there are 5 components that they have determined through research and looking at evidence-based practices are things that make a big difference on whether or not kids are successful as adults. I know it's at the bottom. I would put it at the top of the signpost is family involvement. Connecting activities, youth development and leadership, school preparation, of course, and career development. If you look at this guide, it gives you examples of things that you might do in looking at planning with and for your child or student. The first one, and it describes what maybe some of these would be when you're looking at school-based preparatory experiences. Most of us kind of have a pretty good idea of what that means. You know, what kind of classes they take, what experiences they have at school, that sort of thing. The next section is career preparation and work-based learning experiences. Sometimes when we think about this, we think of those things that happen when a student is in high school. Maybe when they have what they call exploratory classes in middle school, where they talk about different jobs and what it takes to do them. But it's much broader than that. And if you read through some of the questions that there are on this document, it helps you think about those things that maybe not be the customer ordinary things customarily that you think about, so that you'll remember those things that you are doing not affiliated with school maybe, or out in the community that might have a big impact on your student. Youth development and leadership. Lots of nice questions to think about how you can help your student grow in the leadership area, independence, self-advocacy. Questions about mentoring. Connecting activities, those supports that we all need in order to be successful as we go through our life. And different things that might make a difference. Transportation is always a biggie. Making sure we're connected with somebody in the community so that we can build some relationships and our mental health is good. All those different things. And then the last one on the list, most importantly, is family involvement and support. What that might look like. So once you've answered some kind of an assessment or questionnaire, or you've sat down with kind of these different things and thought about them through with your student or your child, what Anne is distributing to you is something that we call the Living, Learning, and Working Worksheet. And as probably most, if not all of you know, when we're looking at responsibilities that we have in special education, particularly for students who are on IEPs, we are not looking just at academic kind of growth, but we're looking at transition and preparedness for living, learning, and working. And the way this document, which you'll notice once again is pretty simple, which is part of why we like it, Does the student have a post-secondary expectation in each area? In other words, what's the goal? What do they want to do as an adult? So, under living, what is the expectation? Are they going to be living independently? Are they going to be in an apartment with a roommate? Will they need some kind of community support? Look at their interests and preferences, not just for their IEP, but also for their living arrangements. You know, my adult daughter can live fine with a roommate if she needs to. I can tell you her preference would be to live without a roommate. And I kind of get that. It's probably a genetic thing, really, because I would probably prefer that too. Same thing for learning and working. The next step down, what are the essential skills that the individual needs to meet these expectations? So that's part of the deal that you need to do in your planning for transition, is figure out where they want to be, what they want to do, where they're currently at, which is why it's really important to know what their skill sets are, and then what would it take to bridge that gap from point A to point B. That's the planning and that's the action, not just planning, as far as transitioning anybody from one place to another, but particularly students to be successful as adults after they finish school. So those are some tools that you'll have to use. Now, one thing I would like to touch on is under number 5, what services, supports, and activities are needed to address the discrepancies or the differences between what skills they've got, what skills they'll need, and what they need to do to get there. And one of the things listed under working is course of study, courses and activities. So those of you who have been involved in IEPs for kids who are over the age of 14 especially, you know that there's a course of study, a listing of the things that they need to take in order to fulfill their requirements. When you're planning for an outcome as an adult, especially where Ann and I have run into this, is for students who are intending to go on to higher education, whatever that might look like. We always suggest that folks think in terms of what do they need to do, be able to do, what courses do they need to have taken in order to get admitted into whatever course of study or program they want to pursue. So some colleges, you have to have foreign language requirements. Some you don't. Some you have to have 4 years of math. Some you don't. So besides the Iowa core, you need to consider what those course requirements are to get in. The twist on it that Ann and I put on it typically is you need to find out not only what you need to get in the door at that institution, what courses you need to take, and what you need to know to get through the program. Because you could be admitted and then find out, oops, there's a catch here. I made the admissions requirements, but they have this public speaking class that they will not waive, and I have to do that to get my degree. So what it takes to get in, what it takes to get through, and then the skills and information, knowledge that you need in order to do the job. All right, follow me on that? So kind of chew on that for a few minutes, and then Ann's gonna share some more information with you.
I just kind of want to go back over the Living, Learning, Working worksheet. I think it's a great guide for you as families or students to use, as well as it's an upfront planning guide before you would start the IEP. And it really does lay it out nicely because it says what is that and where is that target that we're shooting for those Living, Learning, Working. But then, as Sandy pointed out, then really investigating what are those expectations in those settings and what are those skills that are needed in those settings before you even start to say, let's go and get some assessments, because then we're going to have something to shoot for. We know those expectations. What are those expectations to live with a roommate? What are the expectations to, I always use myself, I like to live independently or interdependently because know who to call. Also, if I wanted to be in the culinary arts for a chef, and then my ultimate goal for working would be a sous chef in a restaurant. Well, then what are all those expectations and skills that are needed? And then the next step down is to really assess where are they right now. And then that last step in the bottom, as you flip it over to start planning, is are there skills, are there gaps? So some students might be right on target, but sometimes there's a gap. And we're not talking about a gap or eligibility. Are they still eligible for special ed? We're saying, what are the gaps that we need to fill in for those skill development? And then that's where that planning comes in. So again, a useful tool. Feel free to use it, copy it. Everything we've given you is on white paper, so that if you want to copy it and make it and send it to a friend or take it to an IEP meeting, you're welcome to do that. Okay. We're going to talk just a little bit about how do we make some decisions as we're preparing to look at students in those 3 areas of living, learning, working. And we're sharing with you 2 documents that were made at the state level, and they're called the decision-making guides, and one is for learning and one is for working. And I'm going to have you look at the one that is for learning first. And they're both laid out fairly similar. So we're first starting with post-secondary learning. In the very far left column talks about what is that student's post-secondary expectation. And then the next column over talks about considerations for educational programming. Then that big middle column, I would call it, is kind of some learning characteristics. And then lastly, some possible service decisions around continuing services 18 to 21. I'm going to draw your attention first to the second column, the first bullet. It says completion of I Have a Plan Iowa Guideways. If you'll cross that off, what you want to put in there now would be the individual, career, and academic plan, or it could be shortened to ICAP. That's vocabulary. We talked a little bit about knowing vocabulary earlier. That's a vocabulary, that word or term that you're going to hear coming, because I Have a Plan Iowa, or what used to be called the iHappy Student 8th Grade Curriculum Plan, has been replaced with individual, career, and academic plan. The requirements are still starting at 8th grade, and this is a general ed initiative. It's for all students, but I really want to emphasize that if you're going to talk the vocabulary, and they're going to talk about 4-year planning and some of the components that need to go into what does that include, would include individuals with disabilities as well. Okay, so this kind of just looks at, again, what's that post-secondary expectation for formal education? That's the front page. And then it talks about, here's some considerations that you need to think about when they're still in school. Then looking at some of their learner characteristics, what do we think would be the best service planning for that individual student? The front page is formal education. The next page, if you flip the page, it's a continuation of formal education, but the next full page would be some informal education. So we're not going to go on to 4-year, 2-year certificate. What might some options be? So that would be some informal education. How are we going to continue learning and developing skills? Again, some considerations for programming while they're still in school, looking at some learner characteristics, and then some possible services 18 to 21. So again, a good reference for you. It's not a, hey, follow this line across and do exactly that. but it's something to talk about as a team, to say, here's what we think might be appropriate. Sure. I'm going to just quickly draw your attention to the working consideration guide. Again, these documents were made at the state level, but this is talking about how do we support students when they're thinking about going on to work. Again, I would draw your attention to I Have a Plan Iowa. You can cross that line out again and you would put in the same information as the other one. Again, it talks about things that you should consider as they're still in school. What are some characteristics that individual student might have? And then what are some options to continue for services? You use both guides the same way. We worked on a living one and never really resolved to get it totally finished. So we came close, but so these two are documents that are still available. They're still out there. And again, hopefully will help provide you some information to think about planning for the future. So the document Sandy is handing you now is one around 4+ programs in Iowa. And when I talk about 4+ programs, just going to quickly give you a definition that they're secondary services, okay, so that students still considered in secondary school. The services are included in his or her IEP, and the specific purpose of the 4+ program are to fulfill unmet transition needs resulting from a disability. And they're identified in the IEP. So a 4+ program is a continuation of a district's services. It's on the continuum of services that a district can use to fill any gaps of instruction, and they design it specifically for that student. Again, we're thinking about 4+ programs typically are thought of on a community college campus, but a 4+ program could be developed and run in a district and in the community, okay? We are going to take a little bit of time and study this one. So I'm going to ask that we jigsaw, and jigsaw means I'm going to have different people read different parts. All right, so let's kind of listen to each section and kind of the highlights of the article.
The definition of 4+, we felt that you had already mentioned that it fulfills an unmet transition need for a student with a disability that's been identified in an IEP, and that is to fill in gaps between instruction for the student that's designed for the secondary general education requirements, and that the services must be provided when the student needs them, as long as the student needs them, and as long as the student's eligible for those special education services. Service would be closed, that they still must find another way to provide that service.
So if that program would close, and we've had some 4+ programs that are no longer in operation. So if it would close, or if the student would not stay, then that IEP team needs to reconvene so you can determine what are we going to do now. Okay, so thank you very much for bringing that out. So let's look at the responsibilities of the local education agency, and typically that means the school. Who's our spokesperson?
We talked about still the importance of families being involved for sure, but we also talked that it's important for the districts to know that they're still ultimately responsible, that the IEP is being completed and followed, progress monitoring, and data collection, and that includes reporting that progress to the families. It's also important for the IEP teams, which includes families, to be aware that students who participate are still students of the school district. They can't graduate. This is a continuation of their secondary, not post-secondary, services. And there was questions about graduation completion ceremonies and things like that. And we have, it's very clearly stated that it's determined by the district themselves. So when issues like that arise, it's important for IEP teams to be talking, for sure.
For them to be able to walk across the stage and participate in a ceremony, but they will not graduate. I mean, that would be just as going through the ceremony with their same age peers. They've not, their name has not been taken to the school board for approval. They do not have a diploma. It's not signed somewhere and hidden and put in a safe. They can't graduate now. And it's up to the local school district whether they could participate in a ceremony with their, what typically within the
Their
peers
peers.
they probably went through school with. Okay? So thank you.
The other detail that I just had an IEP meeting this week talked about transportation, and that is still the responsibility of the district. So we thought that was an important one.
So yes, transportation is still the responsibility of the school district should the individual need to be taken back and forth. If they're working on some living needs and they would happen to be at a 4+ program that would have housing, then that would be a different conversation. But if they're just going back and forth, it's still the responsibility of the school district.
This section just talks about what the districts have to consider and when they do that. And I think probably the biggest aha moment for most people is that transition services start at 14, that it is not supposed to be happening in their senior year of high school. And then they say, oh, what are we going to do? Because now they're 17 and ready to go. That it's actually supposed to start at 14. This really talks about whether there's a need to go on and looking at services. Are they appropriate? Is it something they need to do? This is kind of a new concept from when mine graduated, probably from when yours graduated, because it was just kind of an automatic understanding that they would go on through to transition, and apparently that is no longer the case. So you have to have that conversation in the IEP meeting to talk about that. It also talks about that they call 4+ services, which is what happens afterward, but it doesn't have to happen at the school in per se, that it can happen out in the community or at the community college. It's up to the team to determine where is the best setting for the student to continue working on their skills. It does say that if they are involved in the college, that they can, just like it does for students who take classes, they can be paid for if it's appropriate, if I read that correctly. And otherwise, that if it's otherwise, that's the benefit. It's if the college agrees they can take additional courses, it's the parents pay for it, right? And then materials are covered by the district under education, other than if it's like general supplies. When if a general ed student is expected to pay for it, so is the student with special education. And then it talks about housing, which is choice of parent, choice under 2 situations where they could actually get support for housing on a college campus.
Then placement decisions, is that this table? Okay.
So the biggest thing that we took away from this section is the difference between the word placement and the word location. Placement itself is the educational placement or the educational setting for a student with a disability. So this is the services and the technologies that are needed. The location is actually where those services are provided. The placement is determined by the IEP team, whereas the location is determined by administration, usually the LEA board. And while the board cannot override the IEP's placement, the IEP teams cannot bind the board to a specific location or technology or stuff like that.
Very good interpretation. Thank you. Yeah, that was a very good catch. And then the responsibilities of post-secondary institution. I see fingers pointing here.
These are me.
All right, great.
Okay, a couple things from that little section. It talks about the fact that the institutions would provide appropriate academic adjustments for students with disabilities, avoiding discrimination. Does not mean that the institutions would eliminate or lower the requirements, but they wouldn't have to fundamentally alter the program. But appropriate accommodations would be needed. It also talks about the fact that institutions would not require students with disabilities to pay for any of those alterations. And then at the very end of the document, it talks about certifications and degrees and courses are not the ultimate point of a 4+, but they may be accrued, but they're not the purpose of 4+. The purpose is really for addressing unmet transition needs. So.
Thank you. Are there any general questions around 4+ programs? I think this is a nice document. If you need additional guidance around 4+ programs, you could always contact the Department of Ed. This is where this document came from, and it is on their website. One of the things that is typically looking at services for students in the characteristics that you're explaining would be services around WIOA, which is Workforce Incentive Innovation and Opportunity Act. Thank you. Under WIOA, they are involved in the school district, and they're providing what's called pre-employment transition services, and that is before the senior year. And so some of this is looking at what kinds of skills and services students would need beyond high school. I know that there have been some questions and conversations around graduation requirements and criteria and the changes that may be occurring. And I just want to read some clarification. I don't have any handouts for you, but it is some clarification regarding that. It says a policy recalibration is coming, but it will not affect classes of 2017, 2018, or 2019. Guidance will be worked on this summer and released. The core of the guidance will be ensuring that all students with disabilities meet in ways that are meaningful the state graduation requirements. And that was sent from Thomas Mays, the DE attorney, April 17th of this year. So it will not impact 2017, 2018, or 2019 students. Okay.
And we are really short of time. So, and we knew that we were packing a lot into an hour, so we apologize for that. But we tried to do our best to get you information that would be helpful. What I'm handing out now and will be passing out are the list of, we made a short list so it wouldn't be so overwhelming, but a short list of resources and links so that, thanks Ann, so that you have this to take with you. On your table, you will see the beautiful spring flowers that we have. And if you would be kind enough to take one of those, doesn't matter which color, as long as you don't fight over them, we're happy. And what we'd like you to do, and you're going to take that with you as a little memento and reminder of our session, is write down on the flower, whichever petal you choose, something that you learned today, something you want to know more about, and something that you'll be doing to promote transition planning, whether it's for your student that you work with or your child. And I'll read this lovely little quote that I stumbled upon the other day that just seemed to be sitting there waiting for me, knowing the kind of the theme we were doing. And it's, all the flowers of all the tomorrows are in the seeds of today. So in other words, the things we do today, it's like tending the garden that we talked about in the beginning. What we do, the actions that we take, and the supports that we provide are the kinds of things that will make a difference later. Thank you for your attention.